Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 25. In this week's episode, we have a very special guest, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. After reading and sharing some excerpts from The Science of Stuck by Britt Frank, this book was recommended to me more than once. And after sitting in my Amazon cart for far too long, I finally decided to buy it. And I'm really glad that I did. I'm a little more than halfway through it. There are days when I pick it up and I'll just read a few pages or a couple sections. And then there are other days when I can get through an entire chapter and then I set it down and don't pick it back up for about a week or so. Because it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to process, but it's been such a validating read for me, and it's helped me to realize new things about myself. And so I figured I would do just a bit of a recap of the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 5, and dive a little deeper into some of the topics that really resonated with me. So let's get into it. The first note that I have is literally on page 8, the second page of the first chapter. The author starts off by addressing emotional loneliness, feeling unseen by others, and she goes on to say, if your parent was scared of deep feelings, you might have been left with an uneasy sense of shame for needing comfort. This line really stood out to me because even as an adult, I sometimes feel like I shouldn't need the things that I feel like I need. Like I should just be able to handle whatever comes my way without needing any comfort or closure or reassurance. And I think it comes in part from a lack of emotional intimacy throughout my childhood. Not feeling like I could go to my parents with all of my feelings, not feeling safe opening up about anything and everything because I was hypervigilant of what was going on in my parents' life. I was focused on adapting my behavior to what I believed would best suit them or would be favored most by them. Or I was trying to help my parent manage their emotions. There never really felt like there was ever space for how I was truly feeling, especially if that was different than how my parent was feeling or how they expected me to feel. I, like a lot of us, was convinced that I would be bothering others or disrupting the situation if I tried to make my own needs known. And that feeling persists into adulthood, which is why so many of us, I think, have a hard time asking for help. Maybe we're hyper independent, or we struggle to put ourselves first and to prioritize our own wants and needs. When you're dealing with an emotionally engaged parent, or person, I should say, when you're dealing with an emotionally mature, engaged adult person, they make you feel like you always have someone to go to, like you can come to them with anything, and no matter what it is you bring to them, they won't immediately retract their love or support or affection that they have given to you in the past. It's a very safe space. And I think they do this because they're self-aware enough to be comfortable with their own emotions, and they understand that everyone experiences emotion differently. Everyone perceives reality and different experiences in a way that's unique to them. Whereas I think low self-esteem, a constant need for external validation, low self-confidence, and intense insecurities are some of the cornerstone characteristics of a narcissistic person. Narcissistic parents are so self-focused, and rather than developing any kind of awareness of their own emotions or engaging in any kind of self-reflection, more often than not, I think they project their emotions out onto other people, onto the people around them, to relieve them from the discomfort that comes along with sometimes sitting with these more negative emotions or these uncomfortable scenarios. Maybe they don't want to admit certain things about themselves. And so rather than acknowledging them and trying to figure out why they're there and what they can do to make these things better, they just deny the existence of these characteristics within themselves and accuse other people around them of embodying those same characteristics. So now, not only is it, well, I don't possess any of these negative qualities, but this other person does, so let's all point the finger at them. They're to blame. completely removing themselves from taking any kind of accountability or responsibility in a situation. And that can be, publicly when you're dealing with a group of people, or even privately. I think that's where that self-reflection comes in. They don't even feel comfortable, I think, in the quiet of their own mind, being alone, understanding and acknowledging the presence of some of these more negative emotions maybe. Their self-preoccupation, I think, when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent, prevents them from being emotionally attuned and responsive to their child. They might fail to recognize changes in mood or tone or behavior and address them to help their child learn how to verbalize whatever it is they're feeling and move through that experience as seamlessly as possible. Kind of give them the tools to start to understand their own emotions. Okay, what are you feeling? What made you feel this way? Being comfortable communicating the way that they're feeling also to another person in their life is a big step. And then giving them strategies and tips to help cope with these emotions and move through that experience so that they don't remain stuck. They don't suppress these emotions, which will resurface at some point in the future. They can deal with them and acknowledge them as they're happening. And I think that's so incredibly important to develop that skill when you're younger so that you can take that with you into adulthood. And regardless of whatever situation you might find yourself in, you have the emotional tools to handle that, to manage your own emotions and reactions. It's invaluable, I think. On page 17, Lindsay Gibson introduces instincts and the idea that emotionally immature parents don't know how to validate their child's feelings and instincts, and how, lacking that validation, children then learn to give in to what others seem more sure about. And one application of this is in relationships. If you're struggling in relationships, whether it's with a friend or a romantic partner, you might continually rationalize why you have to try so hard for this relationship to work. You might convince yourself that everyone endures this same daily struggle that you're going through. The truth of the matter is, if both partners fit each other, understand each other's feelings, and are positive and supportive, relationships are primarily pleasurable. This was another one of those sentences that completely stood out to me and prompted a bit of a realization. Up until deciding to go no contact, the longest lasting relationships that I had in my life, as I'm sure is the case with most of us, was with my parents. Moving into a healthy new relationship with an emotionally mature partner, the calm at times felt confusing or uneasy, sort of unsettling. And looking back, I think I was subconsciously waiting for the next misunderstanding or frustration. What's around the corner that's going to be problematic, because it definitely can't be too far in the future. And I wasn't looking to argue. I wasn't going out of my way to welcome stress or frustration into my life. I think I just had grown so accustomed to so many things, some that were in my control, most that weren't, acting as triggers to my narcissistic parent. Everything from not living up to my role as defender in an argument, to me calmly voicing that I didn't want to go out one weekend during the day because I was tired from the day before, would trigger that narcissistic rage that so many of us have experienced. It's entirely unpredictable and it's incredibly volatile. And once you've experienced it, you'll do anything to avoid ever experiencing it again. This, I think, is where a lot of us learn to be hypervigilant. I think it's also where that uncertainty surrounding extended periods of peace with a healthy partner might come from. It feels either too good to be true, or you convince yourself that the other person must be lying and something is going to be brought up later. And so you start to go over and analyze different interactions and conversations, searching for something that you might have said or done wrong so that you can prepare for whatever is to come. The idea that relationships can be primarily, like mostly, for the majority of the time, more often than not, pleasurable, I think is so foreign to so many of us who were raised by a narcissistic parent, and yet it's true. When you've developed enough emotional maturity to acknowledge, understand, and communicate your emotions, and you find yourself with a partner or a friend who has done the same, who makes a conscious effort to grow with you, who respects your boundaries, and isn't afraid of deep emotions or a conversation, that relationship can be a source of positivity and light in your life rather than something that brings you down and stresses you out. On page 25, the first page of chapter 2, which deals with recognizing an emotionally immature parent, the author starts off pretty strong, in my opinion, by introducing the idea that seeing our parents accurately is not betrayal. She goes on to reinforce the goal of her book, which is not to disrespect our parents, but to finally look at them objectively in the hope of understanding the reasons behind their limitations. This resonated with me, especially because of the kind of content that I share on social media. It's very personal, it's very vulnerable, and if it makes its way to the wrong audience, which it has on a few unfortunate occasions, it can be very easily perceived as just an ungrateful person who's seeking attention by bad-mouthing her parents. I don't blame all of life's problems on my parents. I understand that their own unresolved trauma probably informed a lot of their more negative behaviors and bad decisions. But that doesn't mean that I owe them my complacency. That doesn't mean that I should have remained blind to the toxicity or to the abuse and forgiven them, even though they never apologized or were unwilling to change. It doesn't make my experience any less valid. When I first started to share and I started to realize that I wasn't alone in this experience, I wasn't the only one to be raised by an emotionally abusive parent. I didn't even know that these different characteristics and behaviors that not only me, but so many of us have experienced qualify as emotional abuse. And the more that I learned about mental health and narcissism, the behaviors and characteristics of narcissistic parents to look out for, and how enduring those throughout your childhood can impact you even to adulthood, I felt compelled to start conducting some of my own research because I was seeking a deeper understanding of myself and in turn my parents and why our relationship has unraveled the way that it has. A lot of the different things that I was experiencing were new to me. I didn't always feel like an anxious person. I didn't always feel like a hypervigilant person because I was doing these things. They were so seamlessly integrated into my life for so long that I thought they were completely normal. And it wasn't until I was in a healthy environment with an emotionally mature partner that these things started to raise some red flags for me, because no longer was I surrounded by people who were all engaging in this toxicity. Now, my negative behaviors that I had picked up on throughout my childhood, even maybe been called upon to mimic on more than one occasion, were starting to stand out like sore thumbs because I was the only one who was doing them. And so it became a lot easier to start to identify them. And once I started to identify them and put names to these things, I was able to start to trace them back to where they came from. And answering all of those questions, developing that level of understanding has been so helpful for me in understanding why I am the way that I am. Why do I react in certain ways sometimes? Where do these more negative impulses that make their way to the surface on occasion come from? I wanted answers. And since I couldn't go to my parents to try to find them, I started doing my own research. And it's really helped me to better understand myself. And that is the goal with everything that I do. That's why I feel so compelled to share these resources and realizations, because I've been there. I've lived in the toxic, controlling household that was governed day in and day out by how my narcissistic parent was feeling that day, by what was going on in their lives. I've also experienced what it's like to live outside of that manipulation. And I can tell you that life outside of that toxicity, it can be hard, but it is so much better. Healing is hard, I think, in general, because you're forced to finally sit with a lot of discomfort that you might have been suppressing or that you might not have even known was there for a really long time. You're reflecting and reliving experiences that at one point in your life you were sure meant one thing, that now, having gained this new perspective, look completely different for you, which can be so difficult. And you're prompted to question everything that you've ever been taught, everything that you believed to be right, everything that you felt at one point or another was a part of who you are as a person. But no matter how hard that is, it's still worth doing. And I think the beauty of being in an environment where you're finally able to start to heal, no matter how hard it is that at least you have the space and the freedom to do those things. We don't necessarily have that same freedom when we're in an unhealthy environment. Moving on to chapter 3, there are 2 topics that I want to touch on briefly, because otherwise this episode will be twice as long as all the rest. But the first comes on page 56, where the author recites the classic unspoken demand of the emotionally immature adult, which is, if you really loved me, you'd know what I want you to do. Now, this has been a topic of conversation for me on social media for months. At this point, I shared a video. This was my first viral video that got a lot of attention, I would say. And it was basically talking about the idea that if my husband really loved and cared about me, he would just know what I wanted to do. I grew up with that way of thinking, that if someone truly loved and cared about you, that meant that they will always be able to anticipate your needs without those needs ever being directly communicated to them. And I talked a lot about how for a long time it was really difficult for me, one, to recognize my own needs, and then to feel comfortable communicating them to my partner. And when I communicated those needs to my partner, if he made an effort to make sure that my needs were met, there was a time when I didn't always feel great about that, because I felt like because I had to ask, that took something out of the gesture, the thoughtfulness. I didn't feel maybe like my partner knew me as well as he should, being that we're partners, because he didn't just know these things. So you can imagine when I read this line, it was like a million light bulbs going off in my head, just validating that this way of thinking that I was taught to believe when I was growing up was so incredibly unhealthy. And yet that is the standard that so many of us are held to when we're raised by a narcissistic parent. It's no secret that so many of us have developed hypervigilance, where we find ourselves always trying to predict what other people want, when and how they want it. We're skilled at anticipating the wants and needs in those around us with nothing more than very subtle changes that inform our decisions. But what makes this behavior, when it's an adaptation of being raised by an emotionally mature parent, is that not only will they expect you to anticipate their needs, but if you don't in a timely manner, they will purposely not say anything, but instead start taking note of how long it takes for you to realize that their needs are not being met. And the longer it takes you, the worse off you are. They'll blame you, they'll shame you, they'll make you feel like a bad person for not paying close enough attention to them. That, if you ask me, is a whole different level of malice and manipulation that intensifies something like hypervigilance. Next up is in the following few paragraphs where the author talks about how to an emotionally immature parent, forgiveness should make it like the rift never happened, as though a completely fresh start is possible. I wanted to touch on this because early on in mine and my husband's relationship, I would get defensive in light of any kind of controversy or disagreement because apologies were not a part of the process throughout my childhood. Apologies were equivalent to admitting fault, which would then be held against you and speak to the kind of person that you were. And so not only was I taught not to apologize, but I was also taught not to expect apologies from other people. Apologizing, asking for forgiveness, and making amends are all signs of emotional maturity. Do with that what you will. All right, the last thing I want to touch on is in chapter 5. Chapter 4 deals mainly with the 4 different types of emotionally immature parents and how to recognize those, which is a bit more specific, I think, to each of our own individual experiences. But chapter 5 gets into how children respond to an emotionally immature parent. And what really stood out to me in this chapter was when she talks about the development of a role self. She says, if your parents or caregivers don't adequately respond to your true self in childhood, you'll figure out what you need to do to make a connection. Instead of just being who we are, we develop a role self throughout our childhood, which will gradually replace these very spontaneous expressions of our true selves, being present and in the moment and responding in a way that's honest to how we're feeling, where our reactions are a direct reflection of what's going on inside, feeling comfortable speaking openly about our own emotions and how we're truly feeling. We don't necessarily, I know personally, regardless of the situation that I'm in, I think no matter how intense it might be, for the most part, I am able to take myself out of that situation and before I say or do anything, analyze how what I might say or do is going to affect the other person that's involved or the experience as a whole. It can be so difficult to let go of that control where, you know, at one point in your life, you taking that step back and calculating every single move of yours was really beneficial to now just be in touch with your true emotions and let those honest feelings shine through. It's very hard when you have so much practice with that and you've kind of fine-tuned the development of this role self, where now at the drop of a hat, you can maybe become a version of yourself that's more suitable for whoever it is that you're around or the situation that you're in. It can make it that much more difficult to just show up as your authentic self in as many experiences and situations as possible. I know for me, I think it partially comes from maybe a deeper seated fear of being misunderstood or perceived in a negative way, even though my intentions are good. I think a lot of it comes from practice also. When you consistently practice molding and adapting yourself to better suit someone else, you become more and more out of touch with who you truly are. What are the things that you're good at, that you truly enjoy? What are your true feelings on this? And do you feel comfortable showing those emotions to the people that you're around? When you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you don't feel comfortable showing your true self to them because either you're not valued for who you truly are, maybe your opinions or your reactions differ from that of your parent, and so you're rejected for how you truly feel. And throughout childhood, when you're supposed to be developing a bit of identity and a sense of self, and you're learning to start to understand who you are, when you're consistently encouraged to adapt to a version of you that is more favorable to another person, where does that identity come in? Your identity becomes rooted in what other people expect of you, and that is just not sustainable. Growing up, I think this kind of behavior can feel almost noble, like I'm doing the right thing. I'm using these skills, right, which I've developed, like hypervigilance, to best suit my family, to fill the voids and the gaps in my family, to help us function better as a unit. But what you're really doing is just neglecting yourself. You're neglecting your own development. You're not investing in your own interests or the person that you want to become in the future. But that's the reality for so many of us, I think, is that we're not given space for that development because we're expected to fulfill a particular role that best suits our parent or our family unit as a whole. One of the best parts of this healing journey for me that I have been on has been reconnecting with my inner child. And a lot of the experiences that I've had where I felt like wow, I feel like I did when I was, 7 or 8 years old. Just that overwhelming sense of joy and excitement and happiness. I didn't know how undeniable and striking those experiences and those emotions would be, but it's also allowed me to start to feel whole. And I think growing up with an emotionally immature parent, when so much of our time and energy is focused to catering to them, we are neglecting ourselves. And so we don't get to fully form into the person that we are or the person that we want to be. And it's not until we're in a healthy environment when we can finally start to shift the focus back onto our own personal development that we can finally start to reform ourselves into a whole person again. And so much of that for me has come in these moments where I'm reconnecting with my inner child. And for me, that inner child is the most reminiscent of my true self. I've talked about it briefly before, but when I look back at my life, especially through this lens of trauma and healing, I categorize it by age. And there was a time when I was 8 years old and younger, I guess from the time that I was able to start forming memories to the time I was about 8 years old, when I truly felt like I was spending time on things that I enjoyed. I think the things that I was interested in were very reflective of who I was as a kid. I think I had the freedom and the space to be alone, to be by myself, and to use my imagination, to think about things, to explore different ideas, or to try things, maybe privately before I would go out and show someone or ask someone. I was able to figure things out on my own and develop a little bit of identity and self-trust. And most of the things that I have done, that I've kind of made a conscious effort to work into my life now as a 27-year-old adult, like art or like physical activities like rock climbing, things like that I had done when I was younger, doing them again now still brings to the surface that joy and excitement that it once did. And it feels like I'm reconnecting with a version of myself who was actually given a little bit of time and space to understand what I'm good at, what brings me joy, what do I like to do, how do I feel about this thing. I feel good when I do this, I feel bad when I do that. And it's been really reassuring and wonderful that when these things do make their way to the surface and I encounter an experience that younger me would have enjoyed and loved, I'm able to recognize them. Because for a long time, I didn't even understand the idea that I was my own person, that I wasn't living in service to or as an extension of someone else. I was my own autonomous being, and I have my own interests and I can make my own decisions. That realization was huge for me. And so I think going from that way of thinking, where I wasn't even aware that I had developed a role self, that I had a true self buried in there somewhere that I had been neglecting for so long, to now being in a place where I'm actively incorporating these different activities into my life in an attempt to reconnect with my true self, to see what sparks an interest in me, in who I am now. I just think it's so fascinating how some of these things that I did do when I was younger in that time in my life that I really enjoyed bring me that same joy as an adult. One of the things that I think really speaks to this role self versus true self dynamic for me is how much I've changed since moving out of my parents' house. I don't listen to the same music that at one time in my life I claimed that I loved. I don't watch any of the shows that I used to watch. I have different opinions on things, and I have flourishing relationships with people that I was encouraged to believe were bad people. The better I do and the more I'm in touch with me, the greater the divide becomes between where I am now and my role self, if that makes sense. And I think that's just really indicative of how much of my personality was informed and dictated by my parent. Letting go of that is a process that is no secret, because it really permeates your life in so many different ways. But it's a worthwhile challenge, I think, and I am happy to be on this journey and documenting this process. Even, going rock climbing for my birthday, I talked about that online, and I'm so happy to have shared that because that was a real moment for me that I feel like I will remember for the rest of my life, when I felt like I was 8 years old again. And it encourages me to kind of keep reflecting on my life when I was younger and to do these things that can help me to feel more like a fully formed version of who I am, who I truly am, not who other people expect or want me to be. On that note, I think I'm going to start wrapping up this week's episode. There's even more to get into in the first half of this book than what I touched on in this episode. I would love to get into it even further. I'm definitely going to do another episode on the second half once I actually finish it. I've only got a couple chapters left, but if you'd like to hear more about this book, even if you'd like me to kind of move chapter through chapter, then definitely let me know in the comments or message me on Instagram and let me know if this episode was helpful or eye-opening and if you would like more like this, because I really enjoyed revisiting these topics with you. So thanks so much for tuning in. If you like this video, please be sure to like it, drop a comment, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.